the battle of 2020. Donald Trump, criticised for his handling of the coronavirus pandemic and beset with a flagging economy, is hoping for a second term. Joe Biden, having tried to be the Democratic nominee in 1988 and 2008, is hoping it's third time lucky. With the president already raising doubts about mail-in ballots and fraudulent votes, it's clear what the Democrats want to happen.
Why the hell would we ever rehire Donald Trump for another 4 years?
Of course, the president has other plans.
Now, if you want to really drive him crazy, you say 12 more years.
And that's a very different approach to his predecessor.
I'd rather be a really good one-term president than a mediocre two-term president.
But what are Trump's chances in November? Because when it comes to re-election campaigns, only a handful of sitting presidents have lost out on a second term. So what makes a one-term president? And what can Donald Trump learn from those who came before him? Right, let's start with a bit of history. There have been 45 US presidents. Well, technically 44 because Grover Cleveland is down as the 22nd and 24th because he was in office for 2 separate single terms. The first one-term president was John Adams, and his son, John Quincy, followed in his father's footsteps. One-term presidents in the 19th century include Martin Van Buren, James Polk, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, Rutherford B. Hayes, and Benjamin Harrison. Now, many of those men didn't run for re-election, but all of the one-termers in the 20th century did. Howard Taft was beaten by Woodrow Wilson. Herbert Hoover was kicked out by FDR. Then there was Gerald Ford. He replaced Richard Nixon and served just 2 years before being beaten by Jimmy Carter. But 4 years later, Carter himself was trounced by Ronald Reagan. So what went wrong, and what are the lessons for this year's election? Now let's start by looking at Jimmy Carter's poll numbers from his inauguration through to the end of his first term. He reached a high of 75% approval in March 1977, but he never saw those highs again, only seeing an uptick in support in late 1979 and early 1980 when Americans rallied around him in the wake of the Iran hostage crisis. Before the November election, those disapproving of him were in the mid-50s. In the election, he managed just 41% of the vote to Ronald Reagan's 50%, with the Republicans storming the Electoral College vote by 489 to just 49. So what was at play? Let's look at these areas: the economy, the opponent, and party unity. The economy always plays a huge role in any presidential election. With Carter, he had already inherited high inflation after years of federal spending on the war in Vietnam. But things got worse. The Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War saw oil prices rise. Inflation in 1979 averaged 11.3%, and the US fell into a recession with unemployment almost at 8% in May 1980. I spoke to Rick Perlstein, a historian who's written extensively about US politics in the last few decades of the 20th century. He referred to an exit poll by CBS News and the New York Times shortly after the election.
They asked people what their most important issue was, and by 33% to 24% to 21%, the top 3 all were economic issues. One of the reasons this broke so disastrously for Jimmy Carter was, not only was he the guy in charge when there was, 10% unemployment and 10% inflation, his answer to that, his policy answer to that, was that we needed to cut budgets and tighten our belts. It was basically austerity.
Of course, against that backdrop, the other party needed to present something different, something optimistic, and Ronald Reagan was the perfect candidate. A Hollywood star with the charisma to make Americans believe the future was bright, and with lines that they lapped up.
A recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose yours. And recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his.
And finally, Carter had to deal with a party that wasn't really united behind him. The president's cautious, fiscally conservative approach meant that many liberals in the Democratic Party weren't that keen on him and saw in Ted Kennedy a viable alternative. Carter ultimately beat his rival to the nomination, but it bruised the president.
The electioneering that Ted Kennedy did against Jimmy Carter was absolutely savage. He said he wasn't really a Democrat, that he was, that he was going to cause a depression. Very tough to get past that.
Trust. Who do you trust in this election?
12 years after Carter's defeat, another incumbent met his downfall. What lessons are there for Donald Trump when looking back at the last Republican president who failed to gain a second term? George H.W. Bush. In March 1991, Bush's approval was at a whopping 89%, historic highs, and yet by the election 18 months later, it had dropped by 50%. In the election, he managed 37.4%, while the Democrat Bill Clinton secured 43% and swept the Electoral College by 370 to 168. And what was at play? Again, let's look at the economy, the opponent, and party unity. Now, Bush was elected in 1988, promising famously,
Read my lips. No new taxes.
but with the deficit climbing, he did just that, angering his own party and the public. And there was a recession in 1990 and 1991, with unemployment peaking at 7.8%.
When an incumbent presides over a bad economy, that determines a lot of voters' decisions. And in the case of 1992, an extraordinary event because George H.W. Bush had the highest approval ratings of any president, and it just went down, 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 down because of a terrible recession.
And just like Carter, Bush was challenged in the primaries. Pat Buchanan gave him a good scare in the New Hampshire primary, running as a right-wing populist who, while he didn't win, showed how divided the Republican Party was. And add to that, a strong third-party candidate. At one point in the 1992 race, Texas businessman Ross Perot was actually in the lead. While Perot didn't take any states in the Electoral College, he secured 18.9% of the vote. That was just under 20 million ballots.
Took away votes that would have gone to George Bush from kind of middle-class, downwardly mobile middle-class white men.
And Bill Clinton was a worthy challenger, a young candidate who, in a way similar to Reagan in 1980, offered a positive, powerful alternative to the Bush presidency, indeed, to an end to Reaganomics.
In the case of Bill Clinton, he was able to say, well, we tried 12 years of Reaganism, and this is the result.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Now, looking ahead to November 2020, Donald Trump appears to be in a similar situation to Carter and Bush in one respect: the economy. Ever since the coronavirus pandemic struck, things have been dire. The shutdown saw unemployment rise to 14.7% in April, having been at 3.5% in February. It's slightly recovered, but it's still higher than the financial crash a decade before. And Trump's approval rating throughout his presidency has never hit 50% in Gallup's polls, with his disapproval rating in July at 56%, around what it was for both Bush and Carter at the same time before their November elections. To unpack the data, I spoke to the director of the Monmouth University Polling Institute, one of the most respected pollsters in the United States. I asked him what's crucial for an incumbent president ahead of an election.
One of the things that we look at when we're polling voters is they make a two-step process when an incumbent is up for re-election. The first step of that process is, does the incumbent deserve re-election? And if the answer is yes, then it really doesn't matter who the challenger is. But if the answer is no, which it is in this case, because Donald Trump, a majority of voters say he doesn't deserve re-election, they have to go to the next step. Is Joe Biden an acceptable alternative? And what we're finding is that voters right now are saying yes, and that's why Biden is leading by a lot.
So is Trump doing poorly in the polls because the pandemic basically tanked the economy?
When the economy was doing well up until late February, the president still wasn't in great position considering how well the economy was doing. You got to remember that, Donald Trump really has turned things on their head, and some of those old rules just simply don't apply. And it's not so much the economy is tanking, it's that there doesn't seem to be clear and consistent leadership.
In 1988, Michael Dukakis had a huge lead over George Bush Sr. in the summer, and then he lost the election. Could the same happen again?
Well, not in a direct comparison, but it's definitely a cautionary tale. The only thing that's different between this and 1988 is that everything that we're seeing in our polling is based on very hardened opinion about Donald Trump. We're basically seeing at this stage that 80 to 85% of voters are pretty much locked in.
But are things really over for Donald Trump? I chatted with Tara Setmayer, a Republican analyst. She is a staunch Trump critic who's part of the Lincoln Project, a Republican group that wants to stop his re-election. But she said, don't count out anything.
We talk about in America October surprises. Last go around, we had a couple of doozies in October. You had the Access Hollywood tape, the James Comey letter. These were all things that happened in the last couple of weeks in October before the election that I think had an impact on the vote. So does that happen again this time? Who knows? No election is ever over until the last ballot is counted. The Biden campaign needs to be fully prepared for the guerrilla warfare that the Trump administration is going to unleash on them. Biden winning by double digits nationally means nothing. What we need to pay attention to is how he's doing in crucial swing states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. The Biden campaign cannot rest on their laurels. Absolutely not. Polls don't mean anything now. Talk to me 2 weeks before the election in October and see where we are.
If recent history tells us anything, it's that a struggling economy is never helpful for a sitting president. Yet remember, Barack Obama won re-election in 2012 with the unemployment rate only just below 8%.
I profoundly accept this nomination for President of the United States.
Donald Trump is hoping he can also weather bad economic numbers and secure 4 more years. This is no ordinary president, and this is no ordinary time. If Trump has turned things upside down, so has the coronavirus pandemic, and recent disturbances in American cities could alter the race. Trump will hope undecided voters start to swing his way in the 2 months before the election so that he doesn't join Bush and Carter in the history books.